The doctrine of discovery was promulgated by European monarchies in order to legitimize the colonization of lands outside of Europe. Between the mid-15th century and the mid-20th century, this idea allowed European entities to seize lands inhabited by indigenous people under the guise of discovery. In 1792, U.S. Secretary of State Thomas Jefferson declared that the doctrine of discovery would extend from Europe to the infant U.S. government. The doctrine and its legacy continued to influence American imperialism and treatment of indigenous peoples. The Christian doctrine of discovery was used to and continues to be the justification of mass atrocities such as the enslavement and massacre of indigenous people. We must work hard in today's modern world to extinguish any standing this document may have in law by having the Pope formally revoke the Papal Bull Edict of May 2, 1493. It is a doctrine made to dominate and dehumanize entire native nations all over the world. This is in direct contrast to our Universal Declaration on Human Rights and the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. The Universal Declaration promises to all the economic, social, political, cultural, and civic rights that underpin a life free from want and fear. They are not a reward for good behavior. They are not country-specific or particular to a certain era or social group. They are the inalienable entitlements of all people at all times and in all places. People of every color, from every race and ethnic group.
The story of the doctrine of Christian discovery is a story of the doctrine of Christian domination and dehumanization. That doctrine is found in documents issued by popes in the Vatican during the 15th century, which declared war on the non-Christian world and instructed Christians to invade, capture, vanquish, and subdue all Saracens, pagans, and other enemies of Christ, to reduce them to perpetual slavery, and to take away all their possessions and property. In the 1823 legal decision Johnson and Graham's-Lessee versus McIntosh, the U.S. Supreme Court used the doctrine of discovery to define Indian land title in the legal system of the United States. On the discovery of this immense continent, the great nations of Europe were eager to appropriate to themselves so much of it as they could respectively acquire. Its vast extent offered an ample field to the ambition and enterprise of all, and the character and religion of its inhabitants afforded an apology for considering them as a people over whom the superior genius of Europe might claim an ascendancy.
These grants have been understood by all to convey a title to the grantees, subject only to the Indian right of occupancy. Johnson versus McIntosh, 1823.
The U.S. Supreme Court in 1954, there was a case that had reached the Supreme Court called Tehitan Indians versus the United States. And in that particular case, it had to do with timber in the Tongass National Forest and given to a particular logging company by the Department of the Interior. And the Tehitan Indians sued for compensation, saying that their timber had been taken from them without a right on the part of the United States. The U.S. Justice Department sent a legal brief to the U.S. Supreme Court in that case. And the main argument of the Justice Department was the Christian nations of Europe having located and discovered the lands of heathens and infidels. And the U.S. Justice Department also cited Genesis 1:28 and the book of Psalms and the Old Testament, and used that and this reasoning about Christians and non-Christians as the basis of its legal argument in Tehitan. The theme of domination is found in various Vatican documents from the 15th century. For example, in the Papal Bull of May 4th of 1493, Pope Alexander VI says that it is pleasing to the divine majesty that barbarous nations be subjugated. The Latin word is deprimentur, which means to reduce, to cast down or press down, to hold down, and it also states that it is pleasing to the divine majesty for the Christian empire to be propagated. Pope Alexander VI stated, We trust in Him, from whom empires and dominations and all good things proceed. If that's part of the Christian message, and by us speaking against that somehow makes us anti-Christ because we're against the domination and dehumanization system, then what does that say about Christianity? But if the domination and dehumanization system is not something that Christians and other people believe in or subscribe to, then they should join us in working to abolish and disestablish the system that has resulted in the dehumanization of original nations and peoples throughout the planet and continues to do so to this day.
The whole relation between the Indian tribes and the United States is the most ridiculous possible. And I hope someday or other, a gentleman familiar with the subject will bring in a bill abolishing the whole system. I believe the very worst enemies to these people, in many cases, are the men that the government of the United States employs as agents to protect them. Our white people constantly encroach on them and do them great wrong. It's the duty of the United States to protect them.
The United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People affirms that all doctrines, policies, and practices based on or advocating superiority of people or individuals on the basis of national origin or racial, religious, ethnic, or cultural differences are racist, scientifically false, legally invalid, morally commendable, and socially unjust. Human rights abuse did not end when the Universal Declaration was adopted, but since then, countless people have gained greater freedom, violations have been prevented, independence and autonomy have been obtained. Many people, though not all, have been able to secure freedom from torture, unjust imprisonment, summary execution, enforced disappearance, persecution, and unjust discrimination, as well as fair access to education, economic opportunities, and adequate resources and health care. The Christian doctrine of discovery was used to and continues to be the justification of mass atrocities such as the enslavement and massacre of indigenous people. We must work hard in today's modern world to extinguish any standing this document may have in law by having the Pope formally revoke the Papal Bull Edict of May 2, 1493. It is a doctrine made to dominate and dehumanize entire native nations all over the world. This is in direct contrast to our Universal Declaration on Human Rights and the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. Now that we've gone through the evidence, it should be clear that this document is still an issue in our modern day. The document is still used in legal proceedings, still being used to subjugate natives. This is unacceptable, and we as fellow human beings should be outraged. We need to take a stand against the dehumanization of indigenous people by getting the Pope and all courts of law to formally revoke the doctrine of discovery.
In 1992, Stephen Newcomb and Virgil Killstreet founded the Indigenous Law Institute and began a global campaign which called upon Pope John Paul II to formally revoke the Papal Edict of May 4, 1493. That campaign continues, and it continues to gain new supporters throughout the world.